Imagine a country rich enough to own almost 1.5% of all listed shares on Earth. A nation sitting on a sovereign wealth fund worth more than 21 trillion Norwegian kroner. By the end of 2025, with stakes in roughly 7,200 companies around the world. On paper, that fortune represents millions of kroner for every Norwegian citizen. Yet this is a society culturally trained to hide that exact wealth so deeply that showing off is treated almost like a social defect. Welcome to Norway. If you step off the plane expecting the neon flash of Dubai or the loud luxury of Monaco, you are going to be severely disappointed. You will not find fleets of gold-plated supercars revving their engines at the stoplights. You will not see billionaires waving expensive watches from the decks of private mega-yachts. Instead, you are met with a capital city defined by gray skies, functional concrete, and an almost eerie level of quiet efficiency. Look at the infrastructure of Oslo. It is not built to impress you. It is built to work. Take the famous Oslo Opera House. In almost any other wealthy nation, a structure like this would be a gated monument for the elite, surrounded by velvet ropes. The Norwegians took a different approach. The architects engineered the marble roof on a massive slant, specifically so the general public could walk right over the top of it in their daily boots. It is a national monument that literally invites the working class to step on it. That is the Norwegian economic mindset translated directly into architecture. To understand why, you have to look across the harbor at the historical backbone of the city Akershus fortress. This is not some decorative fairy tale castle built for royal vanity. It is a heavy stone military stronghold constructed in the late 13th century to protect the harbor. It was built to withstand brutal sieges, incoming artillery fire, and starvation. It has served as a military base and a prison. It represents a long history of freezing winters and sheer survival, not luxury. The liquid wealth pouring through Norway today is a very recent phenomenon, completely separated from their historical reality. The stoic, hardened mentality of the fishermen and farmers who built this nation is still the operating system of the modern Norwegian. The quiet you hear on the streets of Oslo is not an accident of city planning. You are looking at a highly disciplined society operating exactly the way it wants to. But this extreme restraint is not just a polite local habit. It is heavily enforced by an invisible psychological law that governs every single person living within these borders. Which brings us to a very real problem for anyone who suddenly strikes it rich. What happens if you try to flaunt your success in Norway? Imagine a society where success is practically a character flaw. In the United States, if you work hard and make $1 million, you buy a sports car and put a pool in the backyard. It is the American way. In Norway, doing that makes you a social outcast. This is not just a modern trend. It is deeply programmed into the Scandinavian psyche by an unwritten cultural constitution known as the Law of Jante. It boils down to a few ruthless, unspoken rules. You are not to think you are anything special. You are not to think you are as good as us. You are not to think you are smarter than us. Do not laugh at us. Do not think you can teach us anything. For centuries, these harsh rules kept tight-knit, freezing farming communities from tearing themselves apart through jealousy. Survival in the brutal Nordic winters required absolute cooperation, and the individual ego was a literal threat to the survival of the group. Today, that medieval survival tactic is still running the modern Norwegian economy, and it is enforced with a level of transparency that would absolutely terrify the average American. In Norway, financial privacy does not exist. The government operates on a system of radical transparency. With a few clicks on a public website, any citizen can look up exactly how much money their neighbor, their boss, or their brother-in-law made last year. They can see exactly how much wealth they have sitting in the bank and exactly what they paid in income taxes. Think about the psychological weight of that. You cannot fake your success, and you certainly cannot hide it. If you buy a massive house, everyone in town knows exactly what you earn and whether you can actually afford it. It creates a society that brutally polices itself against showing off. Flashy displays of wealth are viewed as vulgar, almost offensive. You do not stand out. You blend in. You buy a sensible station wagon. You wear a practical, weatherproof jacket. You keep your head down and you do your job. But here is where this ancient psychological machinery slams right into modern reality. If your entire culture is built from the ground up to actively punish anyone who shows off, and your society demands absolute financial modesty, how exactly do you handle it when your country suddenly strikes the largest motherlode of liquid wealth in European history? The North Sea is a meat grinder. It is a brutally unforgiving stretch of water defined by force, 10 gales, freezing spray, and rogue waves the size of 4-story buildings. In the late autumn of 1969, an American exploration rig called the Ocean Viking was drilling its final desperate hole after dozens of dry wells. Just before they packed up and went home, they struck black gold at a site that would become known as the Ekofisk Field. This was not Texas crude, where you drop a rig in a flat, dusty field. This was deep water extraction in an environment that actively wants to kill you. Roughnecks worked 12-hour shifts on steel platforms lashed by freezing winds, hauling heavy iron while suspended over a violent gray ocean. Salt water froze to the steel grating. One slip, one snapped cable, and a man was gone. It was brutal blue-collar labor performed by men putting their lives on the line to pull billions of barrels from the seabed. History shows us that finding a massive reserve of oil is almost always a curse for a nation. Usually, the money floods in inflation, explodes, corrupt politicians build massive vanity skyscrapers in the sand, and the working class gets completely left behind. The entire domestic economy becomes addicted to petroleum, ignoring everything else. The Norwegian government saw that exact trap and decided to do something entirely unnatural for politicians. They refused to spend the windfall. Rather than blowing the cash on flashy projects or buying votes with temporary tax cuts, they took a cold, hard look at the math. They established a strict legal framework declaring that the oil belonged to the people, not the corporations, and not the politicians of the day. They created what is now known as the Government Pension Fund Global. They took the massive profits generated by offshore drilling and locked them away in a vault. They deliberately decoupled the oil revenue from their day-to-day domestic economy, investing the cash strictly in foreign stocks, bonds, and real estate. Today, that piggy bank is far larger than most people can imagine. By the end of 2025, Norway's government pension fund, Global, was worth more than 21 trillion Norwegian kroner. It owned stakes in roughly 7,200 companies worldwide, and on average held about 1.5% of all listed shares on the planet. It is the largest sovereign wealth fund on Earth, a massive, quiet financial engine funded by the blood, sweat, and frozen hands of the men who hauled drill pipes in sub-zero temperatures. Norway essentially built a financial fortress designed not for today's politicians, but for generations of citizens who have not even been born yet. But oil is a finite resource. Those reserves are not infinite. Eventually, the wells will run dry, and the massive steel platforms out in the brutal North Sea will be decommissioned and torn down. So how exactly does a nation whose entire modern wealth was built on petroleum prepare for the day the pumps finally stop? Consider the supreme irony of the modern Norwegian economy. Norway still pulls vast quantities of petroleum from the freezing North Sea. In recent production figures, crude oil output has been around 1.7 million barrels per day, and when oil, natural gas liquids, and condensate are counted together, the number moves close to 2 million barrels of liquids a day. They load that energy onto tankers and sell it to a world still addicted to fossil fuels. But if you stand on a street corner in Oslo, you will barely hear the rumble of a combustion engine. Norway has become the global capital of electric vehicles. By 2025, almost 96% of all new cars registered in the country were fully electric. This is not some organic grassroots environmental movement. It is a masterclass in aggressive government engineering. The state placed crushing taxes on gasoline-powered vehicles. If you want to buy a standard gas-powered truck, The taxes alone can push the final price painfully high. But if you buy an electric vehicle, the government has spent years waiving or reducing major costs, cutting tolls, and manipulating the financial math until going electric became the rational choice for ordinary people. You might wonder how a country sitting on the edge of the Arctic Circle generates enough electricity to power millions of high-capacity batteries. They do not burn their own oil to do it. Instead, they harness gravity. The Norwegian power grid is built around steep granite mountains, deep valleys, heavy rainfall, and snowmelt. Over the decades, engineers built a massive network of hydroelectric plants that capture falling water and funnel it through enormous turbines. Hydropower supplies around 88% of Norway's normal annual electricity production, with wind power and a small thermal share making up much of the rest. Do not mistake this setup for simple environmentalism. This is cold, calculated geopolitics. By running their entire domestic infrastructure on water, Norway does not need to consume a single drop of its own petroleum. They can export every barrel of that North Sea oil and natural gas for maximum profit on the global market, pouring those billions straight into their massive national wealth fund. This strategy gives them absolute energy independence. No foreign power can hold their economy hostage by cutting off a pipeline because Norway owns the water and the mountains. They engineered a system where they get rich selling fossil fuels to everyone else while remaining entirely self-sufficient at home. To understand why a nation of just over 5.5 million people thinks like this, and why Norwegians are so obsessed with planning centuries ahead, you have to leave the comfort of the city and look at the brutal terrain that trained them. Look at a postcard of Geiranger Fjord, and you see calm, deep blue water surrounded by lush green cliffs. But a fjord is not a peaceful lake. It is a massive geological scar. Millions of years ago, this entire region was buried under ice sheets, thousands of feet thick. As that ice moved, millions of tons of frozen mass ground its way toward the sea, chewing through solid granite like a colossal rasp. What you are looking at is the exact aftermath of unimaginable violence, a deep trench flooded by the ocean when the glaciers finally retreated. The sheer vertical drop of these rock walls creates a natural funnel for meltwater, and that brings us to the Seven Sisters waterfall. You do not just look at it, you feel it vibrating in your chest. Seven separate streams of water freefall nearly 1,000 feet down the cliff face. It is a massive hydraulic engine running entirely on snowmelt, dumping thousands of gallons of freezing water into the fjord every minute. Directly across the water is a single solitary waterfall, known as the suitor. Local folklore claims the suitor is trying to woo the sisters across the divide, but the reality is just gravity taking the path of least resistance over fractured stone. You would think this vertical terrain is completely uninhabitable. But if you look much closer at the cliff faces hundreds of feet above the dark water, you will see small wooden structures clinging to the rock. These are abandoned mountain farms, places like Skagfla and Knivsfla. A century ago, men and women actually lived up there. There were no roads and no bridges. To get home, a farmer had to row a wooden boat to the base of the cliff and physically climb a near-vertical rock face, often hauling winter supplies, tools, or even livestock on his back. The soil up on those ledges was fertile, but the drop was completely unforgiving. It was a life of constant creeping danger. The edge of the cliff was so absolute and so lethal that parents used to tie thick ropes around their children and tether them to heavy boulders just so the kids could play outside without falling into the abyss. It was a brutal, pragmatic existence where one misstep meant certain death. They harvested hay by hand, with iron scythes lowered it down the cliffs on heavy steel cables, and traded it for whatever they could not grow themselves. This was not a life of admiring the view. It was a daily war for survival against gravity itself. Today, those farms sit empty, silent monuments to a uniquely stubborn breed of people. But the geography that isolated them remains exactly the same. The fjords isolate everything, slicing the country into fragmented islands of impenetrable stone. If the fjords are giant walls of sheer granite, how do you move troops trade or vehicles across them? You do not drive around a wall of solid granite that rises thousands of feet straight into the air. If you want to move goods vehicles and people across this fractured terrain, you have to blast your way right up the face of the cliff. That is exactly what a crew of Norwegian laborers did in 1936, when they carved out Trollstigen, which translates to the Troll's Path. It is a masterpiece of desperation and brute force engineering. To conquer this vertical drop, workers hung from the cliffs using thick ropes, relying on nothing but hand drills, crude dynamite, and an absolute disregard for their own safety. They carved 11 tight hairpin turns directly into the mountainside. There were no computer models or laser-guided boring machines. It was just men, iron tools, and freezing rain. They negotiated with the mountain foot by foot, cutting a narrow ribbon of asphalt that maintains a relentless 9% incline. Driving a heavy diesel truck up this grade requires total concentration. The engine howls and the gears grind as you negotiate blind corners so tight that larger vehicles sometimes have to reverse and reposition just to make the turn, all while inching along a sheer drop with nothing but a low stone wall between the tires and the valley floor. As if the steep grade and narrow switchbacks were not enough of a challenge, a massive waterfall called Stigfossen thunders right alongside the pavement. It plummets over 1,000 feet, spraying cold mist across the asphalt, and a narrow stone bridge making the driving surface notoriously slick. The Norwegian government does not pretend they have conquered this mountain. Nature still holds absolute authority over Trollstigen. For more than half the year, the road is entirely abandoned. Winter buries the pass under dozens of feet of compacted snow and ice. When spring finally arrives, specialized plows and heavy machinery have to be brought in to physically dig the highway out of the mountain all over again. Engineers must inspect the rock faces above the turns every single season because the freezing and thawing cycle constantly splinters the granite. Unpredictable avalanches and massive rock falls dictate the exact day the barricades open and the exact day they close. The road is a temporary privilege granted by the mountain, not a permanent right. For decades, this treacherous route was a vital artery connecting isolated communities and allowing local trade to flow through the unforgiving interior. It proves that with enough dynamite and sheer willpower, you can carve a path through solid rock. The mountains are lethal, but what happens when Norwegian engineers are forced to build a highway straight into the teeth of the Atlantic Ocean? Driving along the western edge of Norway means confronting the North Sea head-on. In 1989, construction crews finished a 5-mile stretch of highway chaining together a broken archipelago. They named it the Atlantic Road. The centerpiece of this route is the Storseisundet Bridge. Approach this span from the south, and the pavement appears to completely vanish into the sky. It curves sharply upward and twists to the side, dropping out of sight like a severed ribbon of asphalt leading nowhere. That optical illusion is not an architectural flourish. It is a highly calculated survival mechanism against one of the most violent bodies of water on Earth. The Norwegian Sea does not forgive weak infrastructure. This coast is regularly pounded by hurricane-force winds and rogue waves that easily exceed 30 feet in height. Standard bridges are designed to let wind and water pass through or around them with minimal resistance. This structure was designed to take a direct, devastating punch. The massive concrete piers are anchored straight into the bedrock of the ocean floor. To build them, workers had to pour and cure concrete while actively battling freezing surf and unpredictable tides. During the 6 years it took to finish this route, the construction site was slammed by 12 separate severe hurricanes. The unique curve of the main span acts as a massive shock absorber. When thousands of tons of heavy freezing seawater slam into the support columns, that violent kinetic energy is dispersed upward and outward through the arch. It is a continuous, brutal stress test of reinforced concrete and tensile steel. Driving this route during a deep winter storm is a jarring experience. Motorists are routinely blinded by heavy sea spray as rogue waves crash completely over the concrete barricades and flood the windshields. It requires a calm nerve to willingly cross a bridge while it is actively being battered by the ocean. Yet for the local transport trucks and commercial fleets, this is just the daily commute. They trust the math, and they rely on the fact that every single rebar cage and concrete pour was over-engineered to withstand the absolute worst the Arctic climate can deliver. The Atlantic Road successfully conquers the surface of the sea, chaining the islands together with steel and stone. But violent water is only part of the geographical puzzle in this isolated country. If you cannot build over the water and you cannot drive over the mountain, what is the final option? You do not simply pave a road over the Norwegian mountains in winter. The snow is too deep, and the avalanches are too frequent. When engineers needed a reliable year-round route connecting the capital to the western coast, they chose to go straight through the solid rock. It took 5 years and millions of tons of blasted gneiss to create the Lærdal Tunnel. At over 15 miles long, it stands as the longest road tunnel on the planet. Driving through the base of a mountain takes a commercial truck about 20 minutes. Enclosed in a narrow tube of dark concrete, 20 minutes is a psychological eternity. Planners quickly realized they had a serious problem on their hands. The human brain is not wired to handle that much uninterrupted visual monotony. Drivers were experiencing severe highway hypnosis. Truckers hauling heavy freight were falling asleep at the wheel, suffering from claustrophobia, and losing their sense of space entirely. To keep drivers from losing their grip on reality in the dark, a team of psychologists and lighting experts stepped in. They physically carved out 3 massive caverns at precise intervals along the route, breaking the tunnel into 4 shorter segments. They bathed these massive rock halls in high-intensity blue and yellow lights, carefully calibrated to mimic the exact color spectrum of a morning sunrise. It is a calculated trick, played on the biological clock. The brain registers the sudden shift in light, the driver snaps to attention, and the fatal monotony is broken. It is a brilliant psychological hack buried thousands of feet below the surface of the Earth. While highway tunnels keep modern cargo flowing, Norway has spent the last century mastering the art of moving heavy steel down vertical drops. If you want to understand brute force mechanics, you look at the Flam Railway. This is a friction-breaking masterpiece. The tracks drop an astonishing 2,800 feet down a steep mountain canyon directly to the ocean floor. Most high-altitude trains rely on interlocking cogwheels to climb or descend severe grades. The engineers here relied almost entirely on standard adhesion. It is just metal wheels gripping metal rails on a relentless one in 18 gradients. The amount of friction generated to keep these heavy cars from turning into a runaway missile is staggering. To build this line, workers had to manually excavate 18 of the 20 tunnels through the mountainside. In the early 1920s, it took 1 month of back-breaking labor to dig out just 3 feet of rock. Today, the train groans and the brakes screech as it crawls down the valley, utilizing 5 separate independent braking systems to keep hundreds of tons of steel safely on the tracks. It is a raw display of mechanical control over a landscape that actively tries to pull everything to the bottom of the canyon. These tunnels prove humanity's mechanical power, But what happens when the scale of nature makes even our biggest machines look like toys? Sognefjord cuts a trench 127 miles straight into the Norwegian mainland. This is the longest and deepest fjord in the country. 10,000 years ago, billions of tons of moving ice ground the solid bedrock down below sea level. The resulting scar is so massive that the water beneath the surface drops over 4,000 feet down, while the rock walls framing it shoot 5,000 feet straight up into the sky. If you drained the ocean water out of this basin, you would be staring into a canyon significantly deeper and steeper than anything found in the American Southwest. Branching off from this main channel is the Norway Fjord. Here, the passage aggressively narrows to just 800 feet across. The vertical cliffs choke out the sky, meaning sunlight barely penetrates to the canyon floor for most of the long winter. When a 100,000-ton commercial cruise liner, or a heavy freighter, sails through this specific trench, our normal sense of perspective completely shatters. A massive vessel towering 15 stories high is instantly reduced to the visual equivalent of a plastic bath toy. The ancient granite walls dwarf everything manufactured by man. Navigating this geography triggers a very specific psychological response. Modern society is built on dominating the environment with steel, glass, and concrete. We build towering skyscrapers to feel giant and powerful. Piloting a boat through the Norway Fjord does the exact opposite. It violently strips away the human ego. The sheer vertical mass of the canyon forces the brain to calculate its own absolute insignificance. It is a harsh, silent reminder that the Earth is massive, ancient, and completely indifferent to human existence. For the ship captains and local crews who navigate these dark waters, complacency is lethal. Rock falls from the towering peaks are sudden and catastrophic. A shifting boulder dropping a mile into the narrow, deep channel can displace enough water to create a localized tsunami capable of wiping a small boat completely off the surface. Captains rely on radar and deep local knowledge because standard GPS signals frequently bounce, scramble, and fail against the dense walls of the canyon. It is a claustrophobic and high-stakes commute. Yet against all geographical logic, generations of Norwegians decided to drop anchor and stay in this hostile environment. High above the waterline, you can still spot the wooden foundations of isolated farmhouses clinging to absurdly steep ledges. These were not casual homesteads. Survival required extreme measures. Fathers literally tethered their young children to heavy boulders with thick ropes so they would not wander off the edge of the yard and fall into the abyss. But humans are stubborn. How did ancient farmers force agriculture out of a landscape covered in ice? You are standing at 60 degrees north latitude. That is the exact same parallel that runs through the frozen wastelands of Siberia and the desolate stretches of northern Canada. By all geographical logic, the ground here should be locked in permafrost, capable of supporting nothing but moss and stunted pines. Yet the slopes of the Hardanger Fjord are heavily loaded with millions of apple and cherry trees. This is not some unexplainable miracle of nature. It is a strict application of thermodynamics. The massive Folgefonna Glacier looms just above this region, but rather than freezing the valley below, the local geography creates a massive natural greenhouse. The fjord itself is a deep trench of salt water fed by the warming currents of the Gulf Stream. This incredibly deep body of water acts as a colossal thermal battery. It absorbs heat during the long, highly intense, sunlit days of the Nordic summer and slowly releases it as autumn sets in. The steep vertical granite walls of the canyon then physically trap that warm air, preventing it from escaping into the freezing upper atmosphere. The result is a highly localized microclimate, where the average temperature stays just warm enough to prevent the fragile fruit blossoms from freezing in the spring. Resourceful farmers have exploited this thermal anomaly since the 13th century, turning a harsh subarctic zone into one of the most productive agricultural anomalies on the planet. But the exact same geological forces that allow these orchards to thrive also created a landscape completely hostile to human error. Just a few miles inland from the calm apple farms, the earth abruptly fractures open at the Vuringsfossen Canyon. Here, the terrain does not slope. It simply vanishes. The river violently plunges nearly 600 feet straight down into a narrow, black abyss. For generations, the only way local merchants and travelers could navigate this extreme vertical terrain was by walking on crude footpaths carved directly into the crumbling cliff face. One misplaced step on slick rock meant a 600-foot free fall onto solid granite. Today, structural engineers have bolted heavy steel bridges directly into the bedrock over the void, allowing you to stand suspended above the exact spot where millions of gallons of water violently impact the canyon floor every single hour. It is a stark, deafening reminder that in this country, agricultural abundance and sudden lethality share the exact same zip code. The geography here provides life, but it requires absolute respect. Agriculture eventually tamed small pockets of this brutal landscape. But farming fruit was never going to make this rocky country a global economic powerhouse. Before the orchards were ever planted, and decades before the first drop of offshore oil was pumped from the freezing North Sea, the Norwegians conquered the global market with something entirely different. Before apples, and long before oil, what was the singular foul-smelling commodity that built this entire nation's wealth? "225 days a year, water falls from the sky over Bergen. It is the rainiest city in Europe. The moisture soaks into the surrounding granite mountains and beats relentlessly against the wooden planks of the old harbor. The smell of salt, wet timber and cold ocean air is permanent. This specific stretch of waterfront is known as Briggen. Today, the tilted, tightly packed wooden buildings are famously photogenic. But for centuries, this harbor was a ruthless, highly efficient corporate machine. In the 14th century, a powerful guild of German merchants known as the Hanseatic League set up operations right on these docks. They did not come for the mountain scenery, and they certainly did not come for the weather. They came to entirely monopolize a commodity that was more practically valuable to the medieval world than silver or gold. That commodity was Atlantic cod. It was caught gutted and hung on massive wooden racks in the freezing coastal wind until it lost nearly all its weight and turned as hard as a wooden plank. This was known as stockfish, and it possessed a near miraculous biological quality. Because the freezing wind stripped away all the moisture, the meat simply would not rot. It could be stored in the damp, dark hold of a wooden ship for up to a decade without spoiling. To prepare it, a sailor or soldier only needed to soak the rock-hard fish in water and boil it. Before the invention of refrigeration, this was the ultimate survival ration. Stockfish was the high-protein fuel that originally allowed Viking longships to sail across the open Atlantic to North America without starving to death in the middle of the ocean. Centuries later, it fed the massive marching armies of medieval Europe and sustained entire Catholic nations during the fasting weeks of Lent. The Hanseatic merchants exported thousands of tons of this dried fish from the narrow alleys of Briggen to the rest of the continent, controlling the market and building immense generational fortunes. The early economy of this nation was not built on precious metals or banking. It was built on calloused hands, salt, and dried cod. To run a commercial empire of this magnitude required a constant, massive supply of raw fish. And the largest schools of cod did not swim near the safe, sheltered waters of Bergen. But to harvest that fish, men had to sail into a freezing, violent archipelago at the edge of the Arctic. You sail north from Bergen into the Norwegian Sea and eventually hit a solid wall of jagged granite rising straight out of the freezing Arctic Ocean. This is the Lofoten Archipelago. Modern travel brochures almost always feature this location, highlighting the thousands of pristine, bright red cabins sitting right on the water's edge, framed by massive snow-capped peaks. Tourists pay top dollar to sleep in them, snapping pictures of the colorful, charming architecture. But the men who originally built these cabins were not looking for a scenic vacation. They were fighting an exhausting battle to survive the winter. These traditional wooden huts are called rorbuer. In the 19th century, impoverished fishermen from all over the country migrated to these remote islands during the brutal winter months for the annual cod run. The government required wealthy landowners to build these simple shelters to keep the seasonal workers from freezing to death on the beaches. They bolted the structures on heavy timber stilts directly over the rocky shoreline and the violent surf. They did not do this to provide a pleasant ocean view. They did it because flat land is practically non-existent here, and building over the water allowed the exhausted fishermen to row their boats straight to their front doors. They could haul thousands of pounds of wet, heavy fish directly onto the floorboards, saving precious energy after spending 14 hours rowing in pitch-black, freezing waters. Inside these cabins, a dozen men would cram into a single uninsulated room. They slept in shared wooden bunks huddled around a small cast-iron stove, trying to dry out their soaked wool sweaters and heavy leather boots before the next grueling shift began. The defining characteristic of these cabins is their deep crimson color. To a contemporary observer, it looks like a coordinated aesthetic choice. In reality, it was an act of absolute economic necessity. Paint was expensive, but treating the wood was critical to prevent it from rotting in the highly corrosive salt air. The wealthy merchants and sea captains painted their sprawling homes white because white paint required zinc oxide, which was costly to import. The poor fishermen had to make do with what they had. They boiled down a mixture of cod liver oil, animal blood, and iron oxide rust. It was a cheap, foul-smelling concoction that effectively sealed the timber against the relentless Arctic storms. That distinct red color was not a design trend. It was simply the undeniable mark of the working class. The entire existence of these cabins revolved around a singular obsession, which was catching Atlantic cod. The waters around Lofoten are a biological anomaly, where the warm Gulf Stream collides with the Arctic Ocean, creating the perfect spawning ground for billions of fish. When the boats returned, the men went to work with ruthless efficiency. The fish were gutted, decapitated, and tied together at the tails by the thousands. Then they were hoisted onto enormous wooden A-frame racks called Yell. These massive timber skeletons still dominate the shoreline of the islands today. Walking through them is a visceral experience. You are standing underneath millions of dead, headless fish, swinging violently in the freezing wind. There is no salt used in this process. There is no smoke to cure the meat. The fishermen simply rely on the precise meteorological conditions of the island. Temperatures hover just around the freezing mark, while strong, steady winds strip the moisture away. The climate acts as a massive natural freeze dryer. It slowly cures the fish until they shrink into rock-hard mummies. This primitive but highly effective method has not changed in over 1,000 years. It yields a product that can sit in the hold of a ship for decades without spoiling, generating immense wealth that flowed straight back to the corporate merchants down south. The men freezing in the red cabins saw very little of those massive profits. They endured the harshness of the sea strictly for their survival, wrapped in heavy wool against an unforgiving climate. They accepted the brutal reality of their environment because the ocean provided a reliable harvest. But as you push further north up the jagged coastline of this country, the geography does not just change. The very laws of physics and time begin to break down. At 69 degrees north latitude, the normal rules of planetary mechanics begin to fracture. 215 miles above the Arctic Circle sits the city of Tromsø. Known as the gateway to the Arctic, this was the final launching point for historical polar expeditions pushing into the unknown. But surviving here requires enduring a brutal celestial reality. Because of the tilt of the Earth's axis, the city experiences polar night. For 2 straight months between late November and mid-January, the sun simply does not rise. The horizon bleeds a faint twilight for a couple of hours, and then plunges right back into total pitch-black darkness. Six months later, the exact opposite happens. The midnight sun takes over, and the sky is bathed in relentless, blinding daylight for 60 solid days. To function in an environment where the sky constantly lies to you requires absolute psychological discipline. The human circadian rhythm relies on sunlight to regulate sleep energy and mood. When that is stripped away, the body panics. The men who live and work here cannot rely on the sun to tell them when to wake up or when to rest. They run entirely on industrial routine. Fishermen go to work in the dark. Mechanics fix freezing diesel engines in the dark. Dock workers haul heavy cargo in the dark. It is an exercise in sheer mental endurance to stave off the crushing weight of a 60-day night. It breeds a population that is pragmatic, tough, and entirely unbothered by discomfort. Routine is not just a schedule. Here, it is a survival mechanism. That long, deep darkness provides the necessary canvas for a violent atmospheric collision. People flock to this region to see the aurora borealis, and often describe it with words like magical or spiritual. The reality is pure astrophysics. It begins nearly 93 million miles away with a solar flare. The sun ejects a massive cloud of highly charged plasma particles that hurtle through space at over 1 million miles per hour. When these solar winds slam into the magnetic field of the Earth, they are funneled directly toward the extreme northern and southern poles. As these charged electrons and protons hit the upper atmosphere, they collide violently with oxygen and nitrogen gases. The impact transfers energy that instantly explodes into visible light. The distinct neon green colors are caused by oxygen molecules combusting roughly 60 miles up. The blues and purples are generated by nitrogen reactions occurring much lower in the atmosphere, You are not looking at spirits dancing in the sky. You are looking at a highly radioactive solar storm detonating against the invisible magnetic shield that keeps our planet from being stripped of its atmosphere. The people of this Arctic frontier have adapted to the darkness, the freezing cold, and the volatile weather for thousands of years. They built their lives around the harsh realities of the ice and the seasons. But an entirely new pressure is emerging, and it has nothing to do with the weather. What happens when the relentless push for modern green infrastructure collides head-on with a 5,000-year-old method of survival? Up in the freezing expanse of Finnmark, the traditional image of the indigenous Sami people is often heavily romanticized by outsiders. You might picture colorful clothing and ancient folklore echoing across a pristine, snowy valley. The reality on the ground is entirely different. This is a massive, high-stakes agricultural and logistical operation functioning in one of the most hostile environments on the planet. The Sami are not playing a part for tourists. They are running a complex meat and livestock industry, and their daily commute involves navigating heavy-duty snowmobiles and all-terrain vehicles across hundreds of miles of brutal frozen tundra. Moving thousands of semi-domesticated reindeer from their inland winter pastures to the coastal summer grounds is a grueling, meticulously planned military-style campaign. The reindeer must move to survive, seeking out specific lichen buried deep under the snow. The herders operate in temperatures that routinely drop to 40 degrees below zero. They rely on global positioning trackers, heavy diesel machinery, and centuries of inherited geographical knowledge to keep massive herds together through blinding whiteouts and razor-sharp winds. It is exhausting blue-collar work, where a single miscalculation or a sudden blizzard can mean the loss of hundreds of animals and the complete financial ruin of a family. But today, the greatest threat to this ancient operation is not the weather or natural predators. It is the modern push for green energy. The government has aggressively moved to construct massive wind farms right in the middle of these critical migration routes. They are erecting hundreds of enormous steel turbines, standing hundreds of feet tall, with blades that span the length of commercial airliners. To build and maintain these colossal structures requires carving wide service roads, blasting through bedrock, and bringing in heavy industrial equipment. For the politicians down south, this is a triumph of modern, clean infrastructure. For the Sami, it is an absolute disaster. Reindeer are highly sensitive prey animals. The massive sweeping shadows cast by the turbine blades, the low-frequency hum of the generators, and the sudden influx of human traffic terrify the herds. The animals refuse to cross near the turbines. They scatter, breaking apart the tight formations that the herders rely on. An ancient migration route that has been used for thousands of years is suddenly severed by a wall of spinning steel. This has ignited a bitter and complex conflict. You have a government utilizing eminent domain to push a global climate agenda colliding directly against an indigenous workforce fighting for their economic survival and their legal right to the land. The Sami have taken the government to the highest courts, arguing that these green energy projects are illegally destroying their livelihood. It is a harsh irony that a civilization functioning sustainably for thousands of years is now being systematically dismantled in the name of environmental progress. The herders refuse to back down because giving up the roots means giving up their existence. If you keep going north past the reindeer, you leave the mainland entirely. What are the rules of survival when you enter the domain of the apex predator? Midway between the northern coast of Norway and the North Pole sits an archipelago where human existence is barely tolerated. This is Svalbard. It is a desolate cluster of jagged rock and permanent ice where the warm ocean currents completely die out. Survival here is not a matter of simply dressing in heavy layers. It is a daily exercise in tactical discipline. The environment is so utterly hostile that human beings are treated as nothing more than temporary visitors. The main settlement of Longyearbyen operates under a rigid set of survival protocols. You do not leave the town boundaries for a casual afternoon hike, as if this were a normal European village. Outside the settlements, anyone traveling into the wilderness must be equipped with proper polar bear protection. The governor of Svalbard recommends carrying firearms, and in practice, guides, researchers, and local workers often move with rifles, flare guns, or other deterrents. Because the risk is not theoretical. The human population here is only a few thousand. The broader Svalbard and Barents Sea polar bear population is estimated at around 3,000 animals, although only a smaller number remain around Svalbard year-round. In this latitude, you are no longer the apex predator. These bears are massive half-ton hunting machines engineered to survive in a frozen wasteland by consuming enormous amounts of calories. Traveling to a remote weather station or driving a heavy diesel snowmobile across a glacier requires the constant situational awareness of a combat patrol. You scan the white horizon because in Svalbard, a moving yellow shape in the distance can change the entire day in seconds. The extreme cold dictates the daily routines of the living, and it enforces strict legal mandates on the dead. The ground just beneath the surface is locked in solid permafrost. Because the soil never thaws, it is completely illegal to be buried anywhere on the island. Bodies placed in the earth simply do not decompose. In the late 1990s, medical researchers excavated the graves of coal miners who perished during the 1918 flu pandemic. They discovered the deadly virus perfectly preserved in the frozen tissue of the victims nearly a century later. If you become severely ill or reach the end of your natural life, you are placed on an aircraft and flown back to the mainland. The frozen earth of Svalbard outright refuses to reclaim the dead. A few hours away by boat sits a chilling monument to 20th century industrial ambition. Pyramiden is an abandoned Soviet coal mining town, perfectly preserved by the freezing and dry Arctic air. Back in the 1980s, it was a highly functional outpost of Russian heavy industry housing over 1,000 hardened miners and their families. They were extracting anthracite coal from deep inside the frozen bedrock. The Soviets built a hospital, a heated indoor swimming pool, and imported fertile Ukrainian soil just to grow grass in the central square. When the coal reserves dried up and the Soviet economy fractured, the town was hastily evacuated over a span of a few months in 1998. Today, it stands exactly as they left it. Soviet propaganda posters remain pinned to the walls of the cultural center. Paperwork sits untouched on wooden office desks. The entire facility is an eerie frozen time capsule, completely swallowed by the Arctic silence. The people who endure the total darkness of the polar winter do not stay here for the scenery. They maintain the heavy infrastructure of this remote outpost because it serves a highly strategic global purpose. The most crucial asset on this island has nothing to do with coal extraction or military positioning. At this absolute frozen limit of human existence, what is the single most valuable thing the Norwegian government has decided to hide inside a mountain? Up here on the frozen edge of the world, the most valuable fortress on the planet sits completely unguarded. There are no laser grids, no razor wire fences, and no armed security patrols standing watch in the sub-zero darkness. It is bolted directly into the side of a frozen sandstone mountain just outside the town limits. You walk through heavy steel doors and descend over 400 feet, straight down into the solid bedrock. This is the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. Most people simply call it the Doomsday Vault. It is not designed to protect gold fiat currency or classified military technology. It protects the absolute baseline requirement for human survival. It protects our food supply. The facility is a masterpiece of passive engineering and pragmatic foresight. The Norwegian government chose this exact location for a highly specific structural reason: the permafrost. If the global power grid were to fail completely tomorrow and the mechanical cooling systems went permanently dark, the natural temperature of the surrounding rock would naturally keep the interior locked in a deep freeze. The mountain itself is the refrigeration unit. Furthermore, the vault entrance is strategically positioned 430 feet above sea level. This ensures the facility will remain entirely dry even if the polar ice caps suffer a total catastrophic melt. It is a structure built with zero margin for error. Down at the end of the echoing concrete tunnel, past 3 successive sets of heavy airlocked blast doors, are rows of simple metal shelving. Sitting on those shelves are vacuum-sealed foil packets containing more than 1.4 million seed samples from gene banks around the world. There is wheat from India, rice from the Philippines, sorghum from drought-stricken regions of Africa, beans from South America. It is a geopolitical anomaly. Even nations that are currently actively at war with one another have quietly deposited their agricultural heritage side by side in this silent, frozen room. Politics do not matter down here. Only survival matters. We often forget how fragile modern society actually is. We build towering steel skyscrapers, nuclear submarines, and complex global financial networks, yet our entire civilization remains precariously balanced on a few inches of topsoil and the assumption of consistent rainfall. When local seed banks are destroyed by civil war, natural disasters, or chronic mismanagement, this vault provides the ultimate fail-safe. It is not just a theoretical concept. It has already been tested in the real world. A few years ago, researchers were forced to withdraw seeds from this very vault to replace the ones destroyed during the brutal urban combat in Aleppo, Syria. The backup system worked exactly as intended. And those ancient seed varieties were saved from permanent extinction. It is a deeply sobering realization when you stand outside those concrete doors. If the weather patterns permanently shift, or a global conflict destroys the major agricultural hubs, humanity will face a hard reset. If the world burns, starves, or drowns, the reboot disk for human civilization is sitting right here inside a freezer in Norway. It is the ultimate insurance policy for the human race, maintained by a small, pragmatic nation that understands the unforgiving rules of nature better than most. It forces you to take a step back and look at the bigger picture of this entire northern society. So what is the final lesson of a country that possesses extreme wealth, extreme terrain, and the keys to human survival? Norway markets itself on pristine beauty and majestic landscapes. But beneath the glossy travel brochures lies a stark reality. This environment is actively trying to eliminate you. The geography here is not a manicured theme park. It is a brutal training ground engineered to test human endurance. Take the Jostedalsbreen ice cap. It is the largest glacier on the European mainland, covering nearly 200 square miles. But this is not just frozen water. It is a slow-moving river of dense blue ice, constantly grinding solid stone into powder. Beneath the surface, hidden crevasses open up completely unannounced, dropping hundreds of feet into absolute blackness. Glacial ice collapses without warning, shifting millions of tons of pressure in a matter of seconds. You step in the wrong place, and the ice simply swallows you. Move away from the ice, and the danger changes form. Along Norway's exposed coastline, the sea is not a decorative background. It is a working force. Small fishing harbors, ferry routes, and island roads all face sudden wind shifts, freezing spray, and violent winter surf. The water may look calm for a few minutes, but the temperature alone can turn a simple fall into a survival emergency. Cold shock steals breath first, then coordination, then strength. In Norway, the ocean does not need dramatic black sand or tourist warning signs to be dangerous. Its danger is quieter, colder, and far more practical. If you underestimate it, you may not get a second chance. Move inland, and the elevation introduces an entirely different threat. The Hardangervidda Plateau is the largest high mountain plateau in Europe. It is a vast, treeless expanse where the weather operates by its own set of rules. You can start a hike in clear sunshine and within 15 minutes be caught in a blinding whiteout blizzard. The winds up here routinely reach hurricane force, dropping the wind chill to temperatures that will freeze exposed skin in minutes. There is no natural shelter. If you are caught unprepared out in that expanse, the cold will systematically shut down your internal organs. Even the wildlife demands absolute respect. Up in the Dovrefjell mountain range roam beasts that survived the last ice age. The musk ox is an 800-pound biological tank, covered in thick, insulated wool and armed with a massive skull plate. They look slow and docile, grazing in the frozen tundra, but that is a fatal miscalculation. If a musk ox feels threatened, it will charge at over 35 miles per hour. That is a solid wall of bone and muscle hitting you with the kinetic force of a small truck. Every corner of this country demands your complete situational awareness. The landscape is completely unforgiving, and nature here operates with absolute indifference to human existence. Surviving this terrain requires tactical discipline and the harsh understanding that you are entirely on your own. Norway is not the wealthiest and most beautiful country on Earth simply because it struck oil in the North Sea. It is not powerful just because it possesses towering fjords, massive glaciers, or the Northern Lights. Many nations have abundant natural resources and spectacular landscapes only to squander them. Norway stands out as a global powerhouse for a much rarer reason. It learned the absolute discipline of restraint. Look at the infrastructure we have explored today. They built an intricate network of highways and tunnels without ever pretending the mountains were weak. They engineered massive vessels to cross the freezing Atlantic without ever pretending the sea was tame. Every piece of steel driven into the bedrock and every concrete pillar anchored to the ocean floor was placed with a profound respect for the lethal force of the natural world. They do not try to conquer the landscape. They adapt to it. Then there is the economy. When they found oil, they did not build glittering skyscrapers or buy fleets of gold-plated cars. They took billions of dollars and locked them away in a sovereign wealth fund for generations that have not even been born yet. They secured their economic future without letting sudden extreme wealth destroy their national identity or their rugged work ethic. The people still pay their high taxes, they still chop their own firewood, and they still keep their heads down. Perhaps the ultimate symbol of this stoic mindset sits at the frozen edge of the world. On the remote archipelago of Svalbard, buried deep inside a mountain of permafrost, they built the global seed vault. It holds the agricultural backup for the entire human race. If the world faces a catastrophic event, this vault is engineered to outlast it. They did not build this facility as a towering monument to their own greatness. They built it as a silent and practical promise to the future of humanity. That is the underlying truth of this brutal and stunning country. Norway actively refuses to show off. Because when you live in a place that has spent thousands of years trying to freeze you or crush you, you learn a very simple lesson. True wealth does not shout. It survives.